the newsagents.
And although, of course, as you can tell, I'm sad that my time as First Minister is ending, but I am so grateful, I'm so blessed for having the opportunity that are afforded to so few to lead my country. And who could ask for a better country to lead than Scotland? Thank you very much.
That was Humza Yousaf, Scotland's First Minister, resigning, admitting that he'd taken steps, miscalculations, that had essentially paved the way to his downfall when he fired those two Green members of the Cabinet last week.
It's hard to believe now, but only 18 months, 2 years ago, the SNP looked completely dominant, politically impregnable in Scotland. And yet here we are, two resigned First Ministers later, staring down the barrel of a third. What does Yousaf's resignation mean for the SNP and what it will mean for the general election, not only in Scotland, but in the rest of the UK as well?
Welcome to the Newsagents. It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And Sopel, John Sopel, is on the Eurostar. But, breaking news, he's not on holiday.
And we know, of course, either way, he'll be gutted not to be here because it's a massive political day.
It's a big day. We're not laughing. We're laughing at the fact that no one...
He always misses it.
Yeah, no one wants to miss a big breaking news story. And that is basically what we've got this morning, because at 12 o'clock, Humza Yousaf was back in Bute House in the official residence of the First Minister of Scotland, and he gave the speech that had been predicted over the last 24 hours. But until that point, no one really thought he would go. They realised he was facing a no-confidence vote. They realised the numbers were tight, and he sat down and did the maths, as Lyndon B. Johnson would say, if you can't count, it's all over. And he got to a place where, in his own words, he says he would have had to make compromises he didn't want to make, and so he decided to leave with his integrity intact.
Unfortunately, in ending the Bute House agreement in the manner that I did, I clearly underestimated the level of hurt and upset that caused Green colleagues. For a minority government to be able to govern effectively and efficiently, trust when working with the opposition is clearly fundamental. And while a route through this week's motion of no confidence was absolutely possible, I am not willing to trade my values and principles or do deals with whomever simply for retaining power. Therefore, after spending the weekend reflecting on what is best for my party, for the government and for the country I lead, I've concluded that repairing our relationship across the political divide can only be done with someone else at the helm.
So Humza Yousaf has gone. Nicola Sturgeon's successor, chosen successor in many ways as First Minister. He was very politically close to her. And just to remind you kind of like the background to this, because it's sort of exploded as a story over the last week. Yousaf and the SNP, since the 2021 Holyrood elections, had been in a power-sharing agreement with the Scottish Greens. Two of the Scottish Green co-leaders had ministerial jobs in the government. That was an agreement brokered by Nicola Sturgeon. When Sturgeon went, that agreement stayed in place. There had been lots of tensions sort of bubbling under the surface. We talked a bit about them on one of the shows we did last week. But then pretty suddenly, middle of last week, Yousaf calls journalists to Bute House, Emily says his official residence, and says that he is unilaterally pulling the plug on the SNP Green deal. Come under some internal pressure from within the party to do that. There had been a feeling that as a result of the Scottish Government withdrawing from or diluting its climate targets, that the Greens at some point were going to pull out anyway. I was talking to a Scottish Government minister this morning who said, look, they were going to do this. This was Yousaf trying to get out ahead of it. But in doing it so brutally, it's clear that Yousaf had calculated, he'd thought, that despite that fact, he could still rely on the Greens' votes in Holyrood, in the Parliament, to keep him and his government in office. And it was a fatal miscalculation because they made clear over the weekend that they weren't going to do so. They pulled a plug. He's gone.
Yeah, I mean, last week we were telling you about, this was John's phrase, the men in grey kilts that had come to advise him that this would be the best course of action. And I was speaking to one key SNP voice this morning who told me that they understood that there would have been a no confidence vote in Patrick Harvey, the Green leader that was then sacked, and that Humza Yousaf would essentially have had to whip his MSPs to vote in favour of keeping Harvey, and that would have created even more divisions. And so essentially Humza went on, as Lewis says, the front foot and got rid of them. And I said very brutally, sorry, but was this a fuck up? And they said, yes, it's a perfect example of all the problems. The execution is so haphazard.
Politics, terrible.
Only a handful of people knew what was going to happen. It was very secretive. It was a bit cack-handed. He was badly advised. And I said, he's not a chess player, is he, politically? And they said, that's the problem. No one in Butte House plays chess. I mean, they meant it metaphorically rather than sort of sitting around of an afternoon. But you can see in this very genuine and very, have to say, likeable man as the first leader, who was really sort of welling up as he had to make that emotional speech, that actually, it's quite nice to find somebody who's not very good at politics.
I don't know. We've had a few of those recently, to be fair.
I suppose, but I suppose what I guess I mean is, particularly when you are working in a PR system, you cannot piss off people that you might need. You have to be particularly good at politics, raw politics. PR meaning that you will more likely end up without an overall majority, ending up with something that looks like coalition. If you're upsetting your coalition partners the whole time or telling people that your government doesn't really need them, then you're already on a bit of a sticky wicket. I think they say a shugly peg. Have I got that right? Yeah. You have to be able to work with your colleagues in a system that demands a lot more collaboration. And famously, he told Ash Regan, who was standing against him for the leadership after Nicola Sturgeon, that the party would be better off without her. He could, get on fine without her. As it turned out, Ash Regan at one point looked like the linchpin, the potential kingmaker with her vote. I think when you're dealing with a parliamentary system which demands cooperation between the parties, you probably do have to be a bit more Borgen about the whole thing, play people with a bit more nous than clearly Humza was able to do.
Yeah, and I think there's a less, obviously he came across well in the speech, and obviously he got emotional about his family, but there's another reading which I think will do the rounds, which was to say that the way he's acting the last week has been deeply hubristic. And as you use the chess analogy, Emily, it's not exactly like playing against a grandmaster, right? To realise that if you're relying on a certain group of people's votes in your parliament to keep you in office, deeply pissing them off, humiliating them basically, as he did, basically yields the potential for them to humiliate you.
Yeah.
And that really isn't, that's not a complicated thing.
He did say this funny phrase to now. He said, well, we won't have a formal arrangement, but I hope it will carry on informally. That's a bit like, divorcing your husband and saying, but obviously, we'll still hang out the whole time, won't we? No, we won't.
Yeah, even the politics of it last week seemed crazy. We hinted at this. Basically, even as a piece of messaging to the Scottish electorate, Yousaf was saying, look, it's absolutely vital that this agreement comes to an end, because in different ways it's destabilising things, it's unhinging us. But by the way, it's been brilliant and it's achieved a lot. Oh, and also, by the way, these people that we're kicking out, I'm looking forward to working with them very, very closely in the coming weeks and months and years. Just as a bit of politics, as a bit of communication, it seemed all over the place. It was all over the place.
Yeah, he can point, I think, to some successes in that short time. He managed the NHS strikes. He didn't have the strikes that we've seen this side of the border. I would argue probably because of his own sort of personal position, he had relatives in Gaza, that he managed to probably be more attuned to where his party, maybe to where Scotland was on the Gaza issue than certainly, Labour has been able to do here. But I think one of the bigger questions for this is Labour were in a very good position with a wobbly SNP. They could point to all the financial, questions surrounding Nicola Sturgeon and her husband. They could point to whether Humza Yousaf really had the support of his own party. Was he a puppet? Was he, as one person put it to me this morning, was he the David Moyes that came after Alex Ferguson? I love the fact that you will not understand that analogy. It is Manchester United. Enough said.
I don't need to understand it.
But I guess the point is now, if the SNP get their act together, if they have another leader or an interim leader who is a steadying force, who takes them away from that chaos, does that make things a lot harder for Labour? I mean, in a way, you don't interrupt your enemy while they're making a mistake. Humza and the SNP were making sort of fabulous mistakes for Labour. I think whatever comes next might make things a lot harder.
Well, maybe, but I mean, I suppose there is one. I mean, we've already heard Keir Starmer talking about it this morning, and it is a line which Labour have used magnificently well and very effectively against the Conservative Party in Westminster, which is the theme of chaos. And now, increasingly, the SNP in Holyrood appear to exhibit many of the same structural tensions, not the same tensions, but similar parallel tensions internally, which makes it harder for them to govern. And they will now be on their third First Minister of this Parliament. But also, I mean, even this process has been deeply destabilising for the SNP itself. And the prospect, for example, that was floated briefly, didn't come to anything, of having to work with, you've already mentioned her, Ash Regan. She was, as you say, an SNP leadership contender, quite an eccentric figure. She went to join Alex Salmond's Alba party. Salmond deeply reviled by a good contingent of the SNP. Think back to those sort of internecine wars between Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon a few years ago. Because, of course, he was their leader. He led them into the Yes campaign for the referendum, independence referendum back in 2014. But obviously he left the party in very difficult circumstances for two reasons. First of all, he was involved in a criminal trial where he was accused of attempted rape and sexual assaults. He was found not guilty on 12 charges and not proven, the Scottish verdict, specific type of Scottish verdict, not proven on one of sexual assault with intent to rape. It obviously was very, very difficult and awkward for the SNP leadership at that time, and it divided the SNP, and indeed in some ways, at least some of the fault lines that are playing out now, to some extent, over-egg it, but to some extent go back to that war, that division between the two of them, Sturgeon and Salmond.
Well, I guess you'd say that the Alba party is a direct result of that division. That's Alex Salmond saying, I'll do it my own way. You didn't push for independence quickly enough and you didn't support me. And he's essentially started, the independence wing of the Scottish Nationalist Party, right?
And to some extent, one of the themes that we're seeing playing out here, and again, you don't want to over-egg it too much because the SNP remain dominant on the yes side or independent side, but you are seeing to some extent the yes or pro-independence forces fracture and fragment a little bit. The SNP used to basically be able to speak for it universally. There was no other significant party in favour of independence, but you've had the Greens grow, you've got Alba as well, and if the SNP fall back, the independent side could to some extent find itself, certainly in the Westminster election, with one of the problems that the unionist side always had, which was they were split in different directions, whereas the yes side, independent side, coalesced around one grouping. Yeah. That is to some extent, only to some extent, starting to slip away from the SNP. Talking to a senior SNP minister, and they were saying, look, the assumption was, the completely false assumption from Humza was that Greens would abstain if there was a motion of no confidence. All of the other scenarios would have continued with the narrative of a failing First Minister. With this choice, he felt he was in control. That feeling lasted for less than 12 hours. But imagine how many of us felt having to listen to Alex Salmond over the last few days, bragging, boasting, looking like he's in control of us. Yeah. That itself has been a deeply destabilising moment for the SNP. So whoever is coming in now, having to patch up all of those internal tensions, those fissures, the things we were talking about last week, the fact that more and more for the SNP, you have just seen this unit that used to be kind of like a block, a dominant kind of block, a hegemon. You have increasingly just seen their left wing emerge, their right wing emerge, and no figure, especially since the end of Sturgeon, who can unite them together. So yes, there's a lot of talk about John Swinney. He used to be the leader of the SNP, he used to be Nicola Sturgeon's Deputy First Minister, Finance Minister and so on. We're not clear if he wants to do the job, but he will only in any case be a stopgap, maybe for a year or two, maybe less. And so then there is a decision for the SNP about what direction they go in. And it almost feels whatever direction they go in, they're going to be less united and less cohesive than they have been in the past.
Yeah, I mean, devolution is very young in Scotland.
25 years next week, I think.
Exactly. It's coming up to 25 years, and they have never before faced this scenario with a vote of no confidence in both the government and the leader. I mean, they've never had a vote of no confidence in the leader. And I guess Humza Yousaf has now sort of put the vote of no confidence in him to one side. But curiously, they could still have a vote of no confidence in the government. I mean, legitimately, they could actually still go ahead with that if they don't find the right person to take over, because when they are replacing the First Minister, I think I'm right in saying it is not just a vote for the SNP or even, former coalition partners. It's for all the MSPs in the Scottish Parliament. And so actually, there are very few people, to your point, Lewis, who fit the bill. Now, Swinney is the former Deputy First Minister. He was Nicola Sturgeon's deputy. He's, in his late 60s. He's been out of politics, frontline politics for a while now. I mean, does he want to come in? Would his wife? I think that's the question. Does his wife want to see him back right in the fray, right at this most difficult time? Is there enough in it for him to actually stay more than a few months doing that job? And then where are you? Now, the person who just lost out to Scotland's First Minister, to Humza Yousaf, was Kate Forbes. Now, Kate Forbes is on a completely different wing, as you say. If Humza is the Sturgeon left, she's on the right. We know that she has misgivings about gay marriage. We know that she feels very strongly about the gender self-ID laws that the SNP was trying to bring in under Nicola Sturgeon. If there are enough people in the SNP who decide that actually her direction is the right one, then they may choose her as the next leader, which would take them, I wonder, in some ways, in a closer policy position to where Labour will be.
Well, I think, again, that just speaks to potential destabilisation, right? Because if there's a contested leadership election, this has to go to the SNP members. That's going to take some time, unless they coalesce around someone, whether it's Swinney or someone else. It's worth just saying exactly what the sort of mechanics are. So now Yousaf has resigned. The Scottish Parliament has 28 days to find a new First Minister who commands a majority. If MSPs in those 28 days fail to do so, there will be a Scottish general election. So, I mean, who would have thought that we might be staring down the barrel? Feels unlikely because the SNP, they have their too short of an overall majority. They should be able to. I suspect their best play will be to appeal to the Greens to say, OK, you've got rid of Yousaf, you've exacted your price.
Would actually work with anyone other than Humza Yousaf or Kate Forbes. Exactly. They wouldn't work with her.
So it was personal for them. So that it's likely, I think, there won't be another election. But the fact that it's even on the cards, no one would have been thinking a few weeks ago.
We've all been talking about the wrong election.
Yeah, exactly. So the UK election, the US election, maybe we'll be having a Holyrood election 2 years early.
Yeah. Let's have a listen to John Swinney, who's been asked exactly those questions about any future role this morning.
I'm giving very careful consideration to standing to be the leader of the SNP. I've been somewhat overwhelmed by the requests that have been made of me to do that, with many, many messages from many colleagues across the party. So I'm giving that issue very active consideration, and it's likely I'll have more to say about that in the days to come.
That sounds very much like a yes.
I'm going to give it consideration. I've got lots of things to think about. There's the whole question of my family, and I have to make sure that I do the right thing by my family. They're precious to me. I have to do the right thing by my party and by my country. So there's lots to be thought about, and I'll give all of that consideration in the days to come.
Well, joining us now is a woman who knows the SNP inside out, its people, its architecture, and probably where things have gone wrong. She was the Chief of Staff to Nicola Sturgeon and her former advisor, and it's Liz Lloyd. And Liz, were you surprised by how quickly things have just unravelled for Humza Yousaf in the last 5 days?
I think, and personally, I think this is personally quite deeply a sad moment for Humza Yousaf. He was very proud to be First Minister, very proud to be the first Scots Asian First Minister, and that shouldn't go unmarked today. But I think from the moment he got rid of the Greens last week, in the manner in which he got the Greens out of government last week, it was evident that this was likely to be where he would end up. Scottish politics is partly a game of maths, and you have to be able to make a majority.
I mean, it wasn't evident, was it? It wasn't evident to him, clearly. It wasn't evident to anyone around him who advised him. Was he very badly advised, or is he just too naive to be a politician?
I think it was a serious miscalculation, and he took the rap for that today. He took it on himself, said it was his decision. I still can't understand why that decision was made in that way. There are people around him who know the Greens, who've worked with the Greens for a long time, who have always known that the Greens would vote against us in a vote of no confidence. They've done that before. This wouldn't be the first time. So why that decision was enacted in the way it was is still a bit of a mystery.
That decision, you're right. I mean, you described it as make or break last week, and it's clearly broken him very quickly. But isn't the truth that he had a very, very difficult inheritance, which the woman you work for as First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, is primarily responsible for? I mean, if we think about the policy issues which have caused him difficulty, gender self-ID, the climate change targets, which were partly responsible for the acrimony between the Greens and the SNP. Of course, there is the finance scandal that is ongoing. And of course, more generally, the fact that Nicola Sturgeon, for all of her gifts and prowess, was unable to actually achieve independence, which is partly at the root of so much frustration within the party.
I'm not going to pretend that he's had an easy year, and not all of the difficulties faced have been of his making. He's also had a very difficult personal year with family members stuck in Gaza. There have been challenges on the policy front, but it has been up to him and this government, rather than the previous government, how they dealt with those policy challenges. They did get rid of a number of policies, and I think they were right to do so. Times had changed from when Nicola Sturgeon was leading the Scottish government. Others they clung to perhaps a little bit too much. But you heard in his speech today his support for minorities. I think some of what he was standing by and what he has been criticised for example, around implementation of the Hate Crime Act or around gender issues, comes from his personal understanding of what it's like to be a minority in this country. And so he perhaps wasn't willing to dump those policies in a way that some people in the party would have wanted him to.
But maybe, Liz, the truth is that both he and you and Nicola Sturgeon, frankly, overestimated the extent to which the Scottish public were willing to go along with these changes. You overestimated the idea that the Scottish public were more liberal about many of these issues than perhaps in the rest of the UK. And it's proven not to be the case. And to some extent, that's proven not only Sturgeon's undoing, but Yousaf's as well.
I don't think, certainly on my part, I've never approached this as thinking that the Scottish public were more liberal. It's about having the powers. Do you do something about it when you had vulnerable groups who were saying they needed change? You have that choice. You have to try and govern for everyone. I think rather than overestimating support, I think we underestimated the power of the opposition to those issues and how toxic they would become. I think if you look back to when something like gender recognition was initially promised, you had Nicola Sturgeon, Ruth Davidson and Kezia Dugdale as the leaders in the Scottish Parliament all making the same pledge back in 2016. A lot of water went under the bridge, the pandemic, the kind of change in attitudes, people's increasing focus on, day-to-day issues like the cost of living crisis. And politics moved on. And I think where there has been a problem, if you like, for the SNP is in not updating its policies as politics moved on.
Yeah, but I wonder whether Nicola Sturgeon has to take more responsibility for this, because, I've been talking to sort of key SNP voices this morning who say it actually goes back to her leadership. She might be a brilliant orator and a brilliant politician and actually a very good First Minister while she was in charge, but she didn't look after the SNP as an organisation. She had no real interest in investing back into the party in a proper vetting system and a code of conduct. People who'd been there for 25 years gave themselves pay rises, no effort put into new membership. She'd kind of just been there too long, accepted the status quo too long and didn't regenerate. And that's why you ended up with a sort of, Alex Ferguson to David Moyes scenario.
I mean, there was an attempt to regenerate, to bring new life into the party. And there's a lot of names being talked about today. Neil Gray, Mary McCallan, Jenny Gilruth, who were, brought in, Kate Forbes and Humza Yousaf, who were brought in by Nicola Sturgeon because she saw potential in them to lead the party in the future. It looks like those opportunities have come too early for them. It looks like they are not ready and over the last year haven't managed to do the pivot that is needed, perhaps felt too much loyalty to what went before them. You have to be a bit cutthroat in this, and maybe they weren't cutthroat enough. But there is a challenge for the SNP now. People can look back at who to blame and what happened. The issue they need to focus on now is who leads next and how they get themselves sorted for a Westminster election that could come any day.
Well, what do you think should happen next, Liz? Where do you think the party should go?
I think it needs to stabilise more than anything. Initially, I would expect that there will be conversations taking place between, John Swinney, who's coming under a lot of pressure to stand and to be a sort of unity candidate, though he may not want to. He may think he's done his time, and Kate Forbes, who would, if he didn't stand, undoubtedly win a leadership election, because she now has a bit of an I told you so factor after the last leadership election.
Could you end up with two different people? I mean, could you end up with a leader of the SNP and a First Minister that was not the same person?
Under the rules, Emily, no. As long as the leader of the SNP is a member of the Holyrood Group, is a sitting MSP, they have to be nominated by the SNP to be First Minister.
OK, so that would take me on to, technically, Stephen Flynn could be the SNP leader and John Swinney could, let's say, be an interim First Minister. That is possible.
That is technically possible, but highly unlikely. I mean, it hasn't happened whilst the SNP has been in government. You have to remember, Alex Salmond did lead from Westminster with Nicola Sturgeon as deputy, but the party was in opposition then. Very difficult, I think, to have someone as First Minister who is setting the policy agenda on all devolved issues, who isn't actually the leader of the party. I think that would fall apart pretty quickly.
Our colleague Andrew Marr was writing in The Times that he felt there had been at times, and he writes as a Scot, a very pro-devolution Scot, certainly, that he felt at times the SNP had had an arrogance to it, which was about assuming that Scotland and Scottish people were very different to what was happening south of the border. So, south of the border, you couldn't get away with ambitious targets on climate change, but in Scotland you could. I mean, do you think there was a sense of how, I don't know, that they sort of acted, or Sturgeon acted like Scotland was already independent in a way, even though it wasn't?
So first off, I'm going to pick up the climate target, but then come back to the rest, is that overly ambitious climate target that had to be ditched was actually introduced by the Labour Party. It was set in minority government and it was put forward by Labour, not the SNP. On that kind of, was there a sense of, I don't know, exceptionalism? It's not one, I mean, I'm English. It's not one I've ever felt. It's not one I've ever sort of perpetuated in government. But I think, the SNP, particularly Sturgeon, governed against Brexit Tories. That was the backdrop. And so you didn't have to be thinking you were special or different to be doing something different. The political directions of the two parties were diametrically opposed.
Just finally, Liz, how dangerous a moment do you think this is for the SNP? They've been on the up, hegemonic, dominant for so long. The last couple of years, basically since Sturgeon's resignation, to a greater or lesser extent fallen apart. How dangerous is this?
It is a pivotal moment for the party. That's why I think it needs to take a stability route. More turmoil will not help in the next Westminster election. More turmoil will not help get them to 2026. People want to just see them govern. They want to see a party actually govern for public services, not fight with itself, not bicker, not brief the newspapers about each other. There will be a decline in support in the Westminster election. When Labour look like they're going to win at Westminster, some voters will always go there. The challenge for the SNP is to make sure that that's a temporary move and not a permanent one.
Really good to talk to you, Liz. Thank you so much for joining us. Really helpful.
Pleasure. No worries.
Well, a lot of eyes right now are on the man who is sitting in our studio here, Stephen Flynn, the leader of the SNP at Westminster, who's giving his first interview since that resignation announcement came this morning to us. First of all, you must have expected this, but when did you first know that Humza was going to step down?
It was becoming apparent ever quicker once we obviously seen the emotional reaction from the Greens, and then of course the demands from the Alba party, which the party leadership was never going to be in a position to accept. And when all routes start to narrow, I guess it becomes inevitable that the consequence was going to be that Humza move on from the role that he was holding. And on a personal level, I'm quite upset about that. I think Humza's held his head really high throughout his entire time in the first ministerial office. He's acted with integrity, with compassion, and despite the enormous challenges that he and his family have faced in relation to Gaza, he's never shied away from his responsibilities to the Scottish people, and I'm just terribly sorry it's ended this way.
Clear something up for us though, Stephen. Weren't you one of those who went to him last Wednesday and advised him that he would have to break with the Greens, which is what he did on Thursday morning? Weren't you in that inner circle that told him that was his best route?
So I've seen this posited by very many people who perhaps overstate my influence and perhaps overestimate their own political abilities. Look, the reality is that me and the First Minister of Scotland speak on a very regular basis. After the Rutherglen by-election, I was quite clear that things, in my view, needed to change. This would have been last October time. And as part of that, I was quite keen to see the relationship with the Green Party come to a conclusion. If I had influence, that would have happened towards the end of last year.
Were you with him on Wednesday night?
I met him on Wednesday lunchtime. I met him. I was up in Edinburgh to discuss the campaign. I mean, of course, we discussed the Butte House agreement, the pros and the cons, and you know, that discussion was that discussion, but no decisions were taken, and certainly nobody was pushed to do anything. And I actually find it massively disrespectful to Humza as First Minister himself, the notion that someone else could go into his house and tell him what to do.
Yeah, but did you advise him? Did you advise him that he should pull the plug on it?
In terms of the Green Agreement, I'm really pleased that we're no longer in coalition with the Green Party. I think it's done the party a great deal of damage. I think that the public perception of it hasn't been the right one. I think that it's led to us focusing on issues which aren't in the same headspace as where the public are back home, and we obviously see that the result of that in the polls. So I'm not going to shy away from the fact that I'm pleased that this agreement is concluded, because it allows the party, and more importantly the government, to get back to the business of backing the public.
As soon as you were in a place where you were saying you got to pull the plug on this, and he did that, somebody must have worked out.
No, sorry, I didn't say to the First Minister, you have to pull the plug on this. We just discussed the pros and the cons, and certainly from my perspective.
But with the cons, you might have to resign 5 days later.
Well,
did anyone see that one?
The pros and the cons of parliamentary arithmetic and all the rest of it. But from my perspective, of course, I think it's a good thing that we're no longer in coalition with the Greens, and I would argue.
But the cost has been that you've lost your First Minister.
So the response is something which. So I don't know the manner in which it was done. I wasn't there, and I wasn't privy to whatever plan was put in place. That's not something that I was
you mean
privy
how he
to.
sacked them on Thursday morning?
However that discussion went, and the whole plan and the run-up to that and all the rest of it, if anything, it was a total coincidence I was there on Wednesday, because I was only there because the Prime Minister went over to Germany. This wasn't something which, of course, was pre-planned in my mind, and I'm under no illusion that if I hadn't been there on Wednesday, this would have all happened anyway. As I said earlier, it's people massively overstating my influence to try and boost themselves, I would suggest, in the public's eyes. But the reality is we've done something which will please the public, which is to ensure that the Scottish Government is focused on the public's priorities, which is the economy, the NHS, jobs, the cost of living crisis.
So maybe you just say it was a price worth paying for the SNP as a whole.
No, I'm very sorry the way it's happened, because Humza didn't deserve this. He's done the right thing, and unfortunately, doing the right thing has led to a reaction which he himself this afternoon has stated that he didn't expect, and of course it's left us without a leader.
Stephen, are you going to be a candidate for the leadership?
I won't be a candidate for leadership, no.
In any form?
No.
Guaranteed?
Guaranteed.
Who would you be supporting? Would you be supporting John Sweeney? There's a suggestion that he could be a caretaker leader. Is that something you would welcome?
So these are deeply serious times. They're serious times for the public, who are struggling with the consequences of the cost of living crisis, who are looking for hope and for aspiration for their future from the government. I think there's only one person who has the experience to do that job. I think there's only one person who can unite the party. I think there's only one person who can unite the country and have that vision that he can then go on and deliver. And I would like to think that person would be John Sweeney. I would certainly encourage him to stand. I hope that he is in a position to put himself forward, and I would certainly hope that colleagues and members would be able to back him if he did.
Would you like to see him be a leader taking you into the next general election in Westminster, but also to the 2026 Holyrood elections, or just a shorter term arrangement?
No. I firmly believe that the next leader of the party cannot be just an interim position. It has to be someone who's willing to take us, as you say, into the general election, but perhaps just as importantly into those Scottish Parliament elections, so that they can present a vision for what the SNP can do for Scotland in a compelling way. John, in his experience, I mean, he's second to none. He was, of course, in charge of Scotland's economy for a very long time, has all the right connections and relationships with the people who matter, who can create economic growth in Scotland. His experience across all the other portfolio areas of government is unmatched. He commands a huge amount of respect. And if I may, we are now a minority government. John Swinney has experience of doing that, and in order to make minority government successful, you need someone who can bring everyone together, irrespective of their political views, and he can do that.
He didn't stand last time. What would be your message to Kate Forbes, who's probably thinking, or maybe considering at the moment, hang on a second, I just lost out last time to Humza Yousaf. Why shouldn't she put her hat in the ring?
So I've got a huge amount of respect for Kate. I think she's phenomenally talented.
This always precedes a
no,
big but.
No. And she it's not. And she's going to have an incredibly bright future. But one of the reasons I'm not putting myself forward is because I'm 35 years old, and I've got a lot of experience still to gain. And it's
not just because you're not in Holyrood right now, is it, Stephen?
And no, it's genuinely because and politicians don't say this enough. We all act like we can do everything now. I don't believe that, and even if I was in Holyrood, I don't believe I'm the best person to take the party forward, because I don't have that personal experience and the skill set which I think is required to deal with minority government. John does have that, and all I would say to Kate is that, look at what John can achieve. Look at what John can do and back him.
It's almost like you're saying, the party's saying, we tried that. We tried the kind of, the new generation, the fresh look, the person who had sort of, come after Nicola Sturgeon, and it didn't work. So now we've gone back to something tried and tested because we're a bit worried. I
wouldn't say it's anything but the fact that John Swinney is a serious man for serious times, and I think that...
What happens if he says no?
Well, I hope he doesn't.
But he might, right? I mean, we know that he's thinking very seriously about his family. His wife's not meant to be a huge fan of him going back.
And hopefully folk like myself, through interviews like this, can convince him. But like I say, he's a serious man for serious times, and the public expect their government to act in a serious fashion. And he as an individual can do that. And if I may, I think the opposition parties in Holyrood would be very worried about someone with his particular abilities taking on the role. Because he will be able to show a level of leadership which is unmatched in Holyrood.
How much of Yousaf's demise was in his control? In a sense, how much of it do you think is about the hand he was dealt by Nicola Sturgeon, his predecessor?
This is one of the reasons I feel really sorry about all of this, because Humza's had to deal with a whole raft of issues which have not been of his making. Both in relation to the party, both in relation to the politics, and also his own personal challenges with his family, of course, being in Gaza. And the hand he's been dealt has been incredibly hard. I think he's openly admitted that himself on many occasions. And it's the manner of the man to be able to respond to that and still have the confidence to move forward and to move on. And I go back to what I said earlier. That's why I'm very sorry that he's had to depart on these terms.
The hand he's been dealt, Stephen, sounds quite passive. I mean, the blunt truth is that the SNP was getting itself really obsessed and really tangled up in gender ID politics. It committed to these low carbon, these net zero challenges, which were almost impossible to attain. It acted half the time like it was an independent country when it wasn't. It had a certain sort of level of talking about the rest of the UK compared to Scotland. And Humza has to take all that on, and you're like, well, he had a tough hand. Your party set him up with that hand.
So look, in terms of that, and I don't want to replay arguments because this is about the future now, but on those areas that you've picked there, the GRR was of course agreed cross-party in Holyrood. Every single party, a member of every single party in Holyrood, the Conservatives, Labour, Lib Dems, Greens and SNP, voted in favour of that legislation when it came.
So you still think it's the right one for the SNP to be pursuing?
Hold on a sec. When it came to the net zero stuff, the target which was set in place was done on a cross-party basis in Holyrood as well. Of course, we've got the responsibility for delivery of that. Where my frustration lies in that is the fact that maybe we've taken on too much ownership of the ability to deliver a bit of that, because ultimately if your capital budget's being cut by the UK government, how are you meant to invest in the way that is necessary to create the environment to deliver on those targets? But similarly, many of the ways of decarbonising, be it through your homes, through your cars, is ultimately going to have to be something which happens right across the UK. So on these policy areas, it's not as clear cut as that. There's obviously been the ongoing scenario with regards to the police investigation, which is the elephant in the room, which nobody is obviously talking about. And when Humza came in as leader, who can forget the fact that in his first few weeks he wasn't able to sit out his stall because events completely out with his control, rightly out with his control, were
He very
were
kindly
taking
talked
shape.
to us, I think, on the day that the blue tent was erected in Nicola Sturgeon's
I think I
garden.
did actually.
It was not an elephant in the room so much as a very
Yeah.
blue tent in the garden.
I know. I still get flashbacks to it, as I think to most SNP members. But look, it's not been the smoothest of waters to swim through. But I think he's given it a pretty good run. And sadly it's ended the way it has. But the good thing is that whoever now comes in has almost a clean slate in front of them, because the hard work's... Well, hold on.
Party finance scandal still going on. You haven't resolved the questions around gender self-ID in particular. You haven't resolved the questions that the fractures within your party.
And he was her deputy. I mean, he was literally... John Sunny was Nicola Sturgeon's deputy.
I was waiting to say in relation to the policy agenda, but you got in there a little bit too far ahead of me, Lewis. Because what's been done by Humza is he has obviously put us into a situation where we're back in minority government, and that affords the SNP the opportunity to refocus and reset on its priorities, and those priorities have to be what the public's priorities are. And you and I both know that, all three of us know around this table, that if we were to go into Scotland just now and say, well, what is your priorities? Folk will say it's the NHS, it's the economy, it's jobs, it's the cost of living crisis.
About which the SNP has quite a poor record.
Well, we've actually got a very good story to tell, but some of that story has been drowned out by other circumstances in Scotland.
Not on health in Scotland, Stephen.
Well, the health service...
education.
Let's go through all three if you want, because the health service in Scotland is the best performing in the entire Isles. There's not been a single strike.
It's not saying a lot.
There's not been a single strike in Scotland's NHS in comparison to the rest of the UK. Our nurses are paid more than anywhere else in the UK, so actually we do have a good story to tell.
And 1 in 6 Scots are on an NHS waiting list.
Is it as good as it should be? Well, no, of course it's not, but we don't have the financial levers to invest in the way that we want, and we have a UK Conservative Party which of course is extracting money from public services, and a Labour Party which wants to go down that same route. Indeed, Wes Streeton himself talks about openly about privatisation. If we want to talk about education, Lewis, as you raised there,
sliding down the PISA tables.
95% of Scotland's young people go on to positive destinations, whether that's college, whether that's
no reform.
Hold on, whether that's college and
an
apprenticeship, whether that's university, where of course no young people in Scotland pay tuition fees, in stark contrast to anywhere else on these isles. So we do have a good record.
Well, we could exchange statistics about that. Well, we could, but
positive destination's a very loose little phrase, isn't it?
Well, that's someone going on to a job, to college, to an apprenticeship,
but more
or university.
Broadly,
that's
you'd
quite
expect
good.
that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, it's good. 95% of kids. That's a success story.
But more broadly, politically, do you think that you or any of your colleagues over the next 6 months up to the general election can point at the Tory party with a straight face and say, look at all that chaos down there, when you consider the chaos that has been over the last 12 to 18 months in Holyrood?
So nobody in the Scottish National Party has been fined by the police and lied in Parliament. Nobody in the Scottish National Party has crashed the economy. Nobody in the Scottish National Party has, of course, acted in the destructive manner that Rishi Sunak has.
You're saying it hasn't been chaotic
since he became.
You're going to be on your third First Minister in this Parliament
since he became Prime Minister, and of course, the public in Scotland are wise enough to know that the damage the Conservative Party have caused to their life is in stark contrast to the positive nature in which the SNP has acted to protect them during the cost of living crisis. But if we want to talk about, and it's funny, I heard Anis Sarwar saying you cannot force upon Scotland another unelected leader when Von Gethens, of course, became Welsh First Minister.
Yeah, but there's been one.
Just a matter of weeks.
There's been one succession there.
In Wales.
And you're going to be on your third.
So far.
Well, yeah, so far, but come on.
So far.
You're going to be on your third in what, 3 years?
No, well, we got Nicola to Humza to someone new.
Yeah.
Labour in Wales have gone from Mark Drakeford to Von Gethens, who, according to all the rumours, appears to be on a pretty short stick as well.
Back, can't you? And be a bit more grown up about it and go, look, You don't want to be in the position, presumably, of emulating the Conservatives at Westminster, and yet it's much harder for you to differentiate yourselves from that look when you keep replacing leader after leader after leader.
So as I was drawing a comparison there, the Labour Party in Wales, their new First Minister is mired in scandal as well. None of us want to be in these scenarios, which is why I think it's incumbent upon
We're all
all
in
of us.
corruption scandals.
I think it's incumbent upon all of us to reset and refocus on what is the most important thing, which is the public. It's not us, it's not the personalities, it's not the people, it's
Stephen,
the public.
if John Swinney says no, will you think again?
Me, no. Honestly, it's categorical. I hope John Swinney stands. I hope that he can be convinced to stand, because I think it's in the public's interest that someone like him becomes First Minister. I think for the party it would be incredibly good as well. I think for the independence movement it would be good to have John back in a leadership role. It's not my day, and I know that.
Will you stand for the next Holyrood elections, whenever they come?
I don't know. I've genuinely no idea. I want to get re-elected to Westminster. I think most SNP MPs look to Holyrood and look at it saying, well, that's our home, this isn't our home. We've got a job to do down here though, which is to represent Scotland, to be Scotland's voice in London, and we'll continue to try and do that, and I'll continue to try and do that to the best of my ability. But politicians, as I said earlier, they like to think that they can conquer the world. I know the limits of my own abilities at the moment, and that includes not running for party leader. I'm not that person at the moment, and I wish whoever takes on the role well, and I'll be there to support them irrespective of who it is. I just hope it's John.
Fancy a crack at it one day? When you've matured? Are you saying at the moment you're not quite ready, but at some point?
I don't know. You never know what the future. You never know what the future holds. I've just got to get through a general election first. That's my priority.
Stephen,
thank you.
Thanks.
I think it's worth explaining why we've sort of dedicated really the whole of this episode to what's happened in Scotland with that resignation. And it's broadly because, I guess, two things. One, the SNP have been this behemoth. Behemoth? I never know how to pronounce that.
A behemoth, that's an alcoholic butterfly.
It is, always drunk and wobbling around with its little wings. I think A, because of the strength of what they have been as a party for so long, right? For, I think, 17 years we counted.
Since 2007.
Right.
So it's astonishing.
So it's an astonishingly long time in power.
One of the longest in Europe.
Right.
Anyway, yeah.
So A, there's that, and B, we were all talking just last week about a potential summer election here. Now, it might not happen, it probably won't happen, it probably is going to be November. But not only that, we are expecting a general election. We don't know, is it going to be July, is it going to be October, is it going to be November? That's still up in the air. Whatever happens in Scotland to the SNP could very easily dictate what happens to Labour and therefore the ultimate outcome of that general election and who governs Britain. And I think there is no independent Scotland as stands. You cannot separate what happens there to what will happen in the UK as a whole. And that's why this is all a sort of rearrangement of power, essentially.
Yeah, and look, the way the polls are at the moment, technically Keir Starmer doesn't need Scotland to get a majority, because if the polls are right, then it should be able to be achievable with the rest of the UK. But the Labour Party would desperately, to its core, to its heart and its psychological foundations, dearly love a vivification in Scotland, a revival in Scotland, because the Labour Party was born in Scotland. The great figures, first great figures of the Labour Party, Ramsay MacDonald, Keir Hardie, they were Scots, and it deeply pained the Labour Party in 2015 when it lost virtually all of its seats in the Central Belt. These seats they used to dominate in until really relatively recently. And, I remember a Labour MP saying to me at the time, the Labour Party without Scotland is like a bird without a wing. But of course it does, just on a purely general election kind of prosaic matter. Obviously it would make Starmer's task much easier. If you can get 20 of those seats back, 30 seats, my word. It not only makes the task easier, but his majority could be even bigger. And
I think Stephen Flynn is right, and we should unpack a little bit of what Stephen just told us. But I think he's definitely right in that Swinney sends out a message to Labour that Labour does not want to hear, which is, we will be a stable party of Scottish government again. And right now, Labour is in a quite sort of relaxed position of thinking, it's all a bit chaotic up there. We don't have to worry too much. We'll be okay there. And I think Swinney does present a bigger challenge to Labour taking those Scottish seats than they would have liked.
Well, I mean, the thing with Swinney is that he seems to be the best guarantor of at least some stability in the short to medium term to keep the party together as a compromise figure, because as we've talked about, basically one of the big themes of this story is that the SNP's left and right wing have become increasingly clear, visible to the naked eye in a way that they'd previously been very cohesive. So Swinney, at least theoretically, would bind them together. I think, there may be an ulterior reason. I'm sure he believes it. But in terms of Stephen Flynn, look, I mean, he basically sort of alluded to it in a sense, which is the old thing about, young cardinals like old popes, which is you can see...
I'm not quite ready yet, but I might be one day.
Flynn, I think, you can see, we've had him on the show before, he's a pretty accomplished performer. He's clearly not without ambition. And, if it were to be Swinney and he were to be there for the next couple of years, that would be just enough time for Stephen Flynn to get himself a seat in Holyrood, by which time he would be a contender. His great fear would be that Forbes would take over in the interim and she would see him out.
It didn't quite answer the question of what he was saying to Humza Yousaf on that Wednesday, just before Humza went to sack his Green cabinet members. Clearly, obviously, you'd say, oh, it's nothing to do with me. Humza's his own man. I wouldn't be patronising enough to say I gave him some advice. But we do know that there were people on the inner circle that Humza was listening to quite closely on that Wednesday. I thought it was evening, but it might have been afternoon. And whatever happened very quickly that Thursday morning. Either it was a massive miscalculation on the part of all those who advised him, or they were setting him up for something that perhaps they could see coming, or it was all his own idea and he handled it very badly and there is nothing anyone else could have done to stop it.
I mean, there's another reason, isn't there, that which we haven't talked about quite as much because it's felt more distant. But there's another reason the SNP's maybe implosion is putting it a little too strongly yet, but troubles really, really matter, which is, of course, the fate of independence itself, which is not quite synonymous with the SNP, but independence needs a political vehicle. And for the last 10 years, it has been the SNP. As we've said, they've been the sort of primary kind of vehicle of independence, the kind of only party really of independence until quite recently. And I think it would be tempting, and I've seen a bit of commentary around this today, to sort of conclude to say, well, one of the reasons the SNP is struggling is because really there's no obvious immediate path to independence. Westminster has blocked it. There isn't this great clamour for it in Scotland. And Labour will come back and everything will be fine. I think that is to underestimate the extent to which the last 10 to 15 years have fundamentally reshaped Scottish politics around the constitutional question. And although the SNP may be becoming less popular, independence itself, according to all of the polling, is remaining pretty robust, between 40 to 45%, if not higher. And as we know, it has a young demographic on its side. Young people are overwhelmingly in favour of independence. So you can imagine a world, particularly if Starmer and Labour were to come in, where the SNP, they may be damaged, but they may not be in a way the Conservative might end up being destroyed or becoming a sort of force which is really, really powerless. And you could see a world in which they might be able to regain popularity under a Starmer government as an alternative to Labour. And so what I'm saying is that, yes, at the moment, right now, independence looks like it's on the slide. But I think longer term, people who want independence in Scotland are more confident about its prospects, if not the prospects of the SNP.
Yeah, and I think that referendum, the Scottish referendum that David Cameron allowed when he was Prime Minister, that he then won for the union movement, essentially, gave him in some shape or form the confidence to think that he was good at referendums. Like, he gets them, he knows how to win them. May have been the most hubristic step that led him on to the Brexit referendum, which famously he lost.
Before we go, we should say, in case people have missed it, we had an Newsagents Investigates episode out on Sunday, which was about the real crisis in temporary accommodation, which is basically affecting 140,000 kids, 140,000 children in this country now are homeless. Just because they're not on the streets, they are homeless, and it is affecting them, as you might imagine, their education and eventually their life chances in all sorts of ways. We think it's a really hidden crisis. It's important. We did some reporting on it, so you can go back on your feeds and listen to that. It was on Sunday.
Listen. We'll see you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.